The Oregon Trail was one of the most challenging journeys in American history, and even though the majority of the trail took place on land, there were still many rivers and mountains that had to be crossed. This is especially true when we consider that the Oregon Trail stretched from Missouri all the way out to the Pacific Northwest. Travelers had to cross countless rivers and several mountain ranges, including the Rocky Mountains. Rivers presented one of the first major obstacles for travelers on the Oregon Trail. In the early 1800s, there were few bridges along the route, and travelers had to find a way to safely transport their wagon and supplies across hundreds of rivers. Some rivers could be waded through with a light wagon or supplies, but others required more effort to navigate. When travelers came across a river that was too deep or too fast to wade through, they had two main options to get their wagon and supplies across. The first option was to build a raft or a boat to carry the cargo across the river. This was a time-consuming process that required a lot of manpower and resources, not to mention a thorough knowledge of the river's current and depth. As an added challenge, travelers had to contend with the possibility of their boat capsizing, which would result in lost supplies and potential injury or death. A second option was to use a team of strong oxen or horses to pull their wagon through the water. While this was less risky than building a raft, it still required a lot of strength and coordination to control the animals and make sure they didn't get exhausted or injured. It also required at least one person to abandon the wagon and sit on top of the cargo to make sure everything stayed waterproof. Both methods were fraught with challenges, and travelers had to carefully weigh the risks and benefits of each before deciding how to proceed. On top of the difficulty in transporting their goods, travelers also had to worry about the safety of themselves and their families. Many rivers along the Oregon Trail were home to dangerous currents and unpredictable waters, making it difficult to navigate even for experienced boatmen. Additionally, some rivers were inhabited by wild animals such as bears and mountain lions, which could pose a threat to travelers and their livestock. Despite these dangers, travelers pressed on, determined to reach the end of their journey. Those who successfully navigated the rivers and arrived at their destination in Oregon often found it to be worth the arduous journey. But rivers weren't the only obstacle that travelers on the Oregon Trail had to face. The Rocky Mountains also posed a significant challenge to those traveling west. The Rocky Mountains were a massive range that stretched from Canada all the way down to Mexico, and travelers on the Oregon Trail had to cross several of its peaks and passes in order to reach their destination. One of the most daunting tasks facing travelers was finding a route through the mountains. Early explorers and guides had identified several possible routes, but it was up to each individual party to decide which one to take. Each route was difficult in its own way, and travelers had to consider factors such as the steepness of the terrain, the availability of food and water, and the risk of encountering wild animals or hostile Native American tribes. Once a route was chosen, travelers had to contend with the difficult terrain itself. The Rocky Mountains were known for their steep slopes, rocky paths and deep valleys, making it difficult to navigate even on foot, let alone with a heavy wagon train. In addition, the mountains were home to a variety of dangerous animals, including bears, mountain lions and wolves, which posed a constant threat to both travelers and their livestock. Despite these challenges, travelers pressed on, determined to reach the other side of the mountains and continue their journey west. Those who successfully navigated the Rockies were rewarded with stunning views and a sense of accomplishment that was hard to match. But the journey was far from over, and new challenges awaited them in the Pacific Northwest. In addition to the physical challenges of crossing the Rocky Mountains, travelers also had to contend with the psychological toll that the journey took on them. The isolation and monotony of the journey, coupled with the constant threat of danger, could be mentally exhausting. Travelers had to stay alert at all times to watch out for potential threats, whether it was an animal attack, an accident, or an encounter with a Native American tribe. In addition, the lack of privacy and the close quarters in which travelers had to live could also be stressful and uncomfortable. With little to no privacy, travelers had to share their wagons with their family members and any other travelers that they chose to group up with. Despite these challenges, travelers on the Oregon Trail were often reluctant to turn back. Once they had made the decision to head west, they were committed to seeing the journey through to the end. Many travelers had left their previous lives behind in order to start anew in Oregon, and they were unwilling to give up on their dreams simply because the journey was difficult. However, some travelers did turn back after realizing that the physical and psychological toll of the journey was simply too much to bear. These travelers likely suffered from a combination of exhaustion, fear, and homesickness, which ultimately led them to abandon their journey and return to civilization. For those who did turn back, the Oregon Trail remained a daunting reminder of the challenges and sacrifices required to settle the American West. One of the most significant challenges that travelers faced on the Oregon Trail was the severe weather conditions that they encountered along the way. The trail stretched over 2,000 miles through a variety of climates, from the hot and humid plains of Missouri to the cold and snowy Rocky Mountains. Travelers had to endure extreme heat, bitter cold, and frequent storms, all of which tested their resilience and determination. The extreme heat of the summer months could be particularly brutal, causing dehydration and fatigue among travelers. Temperatures often reached well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and travelers had to ration their water supplies carefully to avoid running out. The heat also made it difficult to sleep, and many travelers suffered from exhaustion and sunstroke. On the other hand, the bitter cold of the winter months posed a different set of challenges. Temperatures could drop well below freezing, and travelers had to take precautions to avoid frostbite and hypothermia. They had to wear multiple layers of clothing and cover their wagons with blankets to keep warm. The cold also made it difficult to cook and clean, and travelers often had to melt snow for water, which could be a time-consuming process. In addition to the extreme temperatures, travelers also had to deal with frequent storms, which could last for days or even weeks at a time. Storms could damage the already muddy trail, making it difficult to navigate. They could also cause accidents as travelers struggled to maintain control of their wagons on the slippery terrain. Storms could also destroy supplies, damaging equipment and ruining food, which could further delay their journey. Travelers often had to wait for the storms to pass before continuing on, which could add days or even weeks to their travel time. One of the most frustrating aspects of the storms was the thick layer of mud that they left behind. The muddy made the terrain treacherous and often caused accidents and injuries. Travelers had to be constantly on the lookout for holes and ruts in the road, and even a slight slip could result in a broken bone or a concussion. The mud also made it difficult to keep their wagons on track, and many travelers suffered from sore muscles and blisters from holding onto the wagon tongue for support. Frequent storms also meant that the trails quickly became impassable. As the rain fell, the already muddy ground turned into a sticky, thick substance that sucked at the wheels of the wagons and made it difficult to move forward. To make matters worse, the mud often dried in the ruts left by the wagon wheels, creating a hard, uneven surface that was difficult to navigate. This meant that travelers had to spend extra time and energy trying to keep their wagons on the trail and avoid getting stuck in the mud. In addition to the physical challenges of crossing rivers and mountains, travelers on the Oregon Trail also had to contend with the psychological effects of the journey. The isolation and monotony of the journey, coupled with the constant threat of danger, could be mentally exhausting. As they traveled day after day through unfamiliar landscapes, travelers had to stay alert at all times to watch out for potential threats, whether it was an animal attack, an accident, or an encounter with a Native American tribe. This constant state of alertness took a toll on their mental health, and many travelers began to feel isolated and cut off from civilization. Another challenge that travelers faced was the lack of privacy and the close quarters in which they had to live. With little to no privacy, travelers had to share their wagons with their family members and any other travelers that they chose to group up with. This could lead to tension and conflict, and the stress of the journey could exacerbate any pre-existing tensions within the group. Overall, the Oregon Trail was a grueling and challenging journey that tested the physical and mental endurance of those who traveled it. The combination of extreme weather, difficult terrain, and isolation created a perfect storm of adversity that challenged travelers like never before. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please let us know by giving it a thumbs up. We also love to hear what you have to say, so feel free to leave a comment below. And if you haven't done so already, go ahead and subscribe to stay up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.